Good morning, everyone on the line with us today. Welcome to what we're calling a collaboration webinar between RChilli and Proceptual. We're going to be discussing the topic of staying compliant with AI-driven and automated hiring systems. My name is Michael Josifovski. I'm the head of global partnerships at RChilli, and alongside me today, John Rood, CEO at Proceptual. So, John, great to be presenting with you today.
Thanks, Michael. It's great to be presenting with you. Should be a good one.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're excited to dive deeper into this topic with you all and talk more about how the collaboration between RChilli and Proceptual can help your organizations achieve effective, bias-free recruitment and ensure compliance with the emerging AI regulations. So we'll go ahead and kind of kick things off. But for the folks on the call who may not know about RChilli, I'll just kind of give a brief overview about us. We're an industry-leading provider of advanced recruitment solutions. And we've been truly revolutionizing the way organizations hire and manage talent. We're trusted by numerous organizations globally, ranging from small businesses to large enterprises and across various industries. So we have over 1,600 customers across 44 countries and many Fortune 500 customers as well. And really year over year, especially over the last 5 years, we've continued to grow very rapidly. So talking a little bit more about kind of what RChilli does, our solutions are designed to empower HR teams in their recruitment efforts and make it as easy as possible to find the best talent when hiring for a role. So we provide a comprehensive suite of products that are designed to maximize these hiring outcomes. We focus on leveraging AI and automation so that we can really streamline that recruitment process and drive efficiency home. And so that includes make it easy for the candidate to apply with one-click candidate apply, resume parsing, object-based scanning of resumes, a search and match functionality that's really advanced, data enrichment, and easy integration into any of the ATS platforms that they might be using. So talking a little bit about, what does that mean from a workflow perspective and a use case perspective? By utilizing the advanced algorithms, we extract essential information from resumes. This saves the recruiters time and ensures that no crucial details are overlooked. We also have a skills-based matching and enrichment taxonomies built in. So we properly prioritize candidate qualifications, enabling HR teams to make the most informed decisions and ensure that those decisions are based on skills and experience. And then because of that, we're able to match proper candidates to jobs, but also kind of reverse it where we can match proper jobs to candidates. So it makes it a really powerful tool in ensuring that the right candidate gets the right fit. And furthermore, we seamlessly integrate this with any applicant tracking system, further streamlining the recruitment process for HR teams, ensuring a smooth and efficient workflow, and enabling you to focus on finding the best fit candidates for the jobs that you're hiring for. So through this ecosystem, RChilli can ensure its commitment to helping organizations find that fit and then continue to provide cutting edge technology, exceptional customer service, and always continuously innovating for our clients. So from a high level overview in the products, that's kind of how the ecosystem works and what we're trying to drive home when it comes to helping out HR teams. But diving a little bit into kind of the topic at hand, which is the compliance side of things and then the bias piece to it. Already RChilli has redaction capabilities and that mitigate bias built in to the platform as it stands today. As many people may know, the bias in the recruitment process is an important piece to consider when we think about compliance and equal opportunity. So biased recruiting decisions, they hinder diversity within the workplace, but they also limit the potential for finding the best fit candidates. And so one key feature of RChilli's solutions is that there's the redaction capabilities built in, and it gives our HR teams the ability to easily redact sensitive information, such as names, addresses, contact details, and any other confidential data pertaining to a specific job or a specific role. This eliminates the possibility of conscious or even unconscious bias in the decision-making process and ensures the candidate is judged purely on the skills and abilities of the role. And, furthermore, redaction is also really crucial for maintaining compliance with data privacy regulations, so such as GDPR and California Consumer Privacy Act. So essentially, HR teams that utilize RChilli solutions can quickly and confidently process sensitive information, ensure compliance, uphold those data privacy standards, and then mitigate the bias from the recruitment process, which is obviously an important piece to the puzzle for all of us here. So with that said, I'd like to discuss the kind of collaboration between RChilli and Proceptual. John Rood and the Proceptual team are sharing their expertise in the emerging space of AI regulations. And he's working to help HR managers navigate this ever-changing space and stay compliant while using AI-powered tools in the recruitment process. So we've partnered together to strengthen RChilli's commitment in helping organizations stay ahead of the curve in this, and really stay ahead of the curve in all aspects of the recruitment. So now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to John to talk a little bit more about the details and kind of the emerging regulations and talk more about Proceptual. So John.
All right. Thanks, Michael, very much. Let's pop open my screen here. All right. Did my slideshow come up okay, Michael?
Yep.
Okay, cool. There I am. Nice to be here, and thanks to Michael and the RChilli team for putting this together. So I won't spend long on myself here. I'm the founder of Proceptual. As Michael said, what we do is we provide tech-enabled compliance solutions for companies to comply with both existing and emerging regulation of AI technology in HR. As we go through here, please feel free to toss your questions in the chat. I'll be looking over there a little bit, see if things pop up, and then definitely at the end of our presentation, love to take any questions about this topic, or love to cover them offline via email as well. So as we go through the discussion here, I always start by saying, like, I sometimes kind of bring some of the doom and gloom around AI, and that's not intentional. I think that AI tools in society in general, and in particular in HR and hiring, have just enormous potential to speed the hiring process, to make better hiring matches. And I'm a big believer in the potential of AI tools like RChilli to reduce bias. So as we go through here, I always want to make sure that it's really clear that this is an incredible opportunity for us as HR leaders and for us as managers to make our tools, our processes better. And it's just a matter of kind of being thoughtful as we go through it and aware of what are the downsides and what are the ways that we can kind of mitigate those downsides. So today we're going to talk really briefly about how AI is being used in the HR workforce now, and then importantly, as these tools advance, what sort of use cases are we going to see over the next kind of 6 to 18 months? Secondly, we're going to talk about the 3 pillars of what I consider to be safe or ethical deployment of AI, and go through a couple of case studies there. We're going to talk about some of the emerging and existing compliance requirements to using AI tools, and then talk a little bit towards the end about how partners are partnering with folks like RChilli, how employers are working with their vendors to make sure they're on the right side, both of the compliance obligations and also kind of like these ethical considerations that we talked about. So I always show this slide, and I think that if you're on the webinar today, to Michael's point, it's clear that if you're an RChilli customer, you're using AI. But a lot of people that I've talked to, especially in smaller HR departments or in kind of the prototypical HR department of one, are not aware of kind of all the applications that use AI in these tools. So just really briefly, the biggest places that we see the use of AI, or what we sometimes just call automated tools or automated decision making, is first of all resume scanning and sorting. So the kind of work that Michael's talking about, we do at RChilli. Secondly, pre-hire assessments, and I think that this is going to be one of the really big emerging areas for AI. I think that over the past like 50 plus years, there's been pre-hire assessments all over the place, predictive index, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're seeing this next generation where it's not like just giving a test about work-ready skills. It's more like, come play this game where you pick the order of balloons to pump up, and the order that you pick is going to tell us something about your personality, where not to doubt that those tools may be useful, but the connection between what the candidate is being asked to do and the result that the HR manager is expecting to get out of those tools is not as clear as it might have been with kind of previous generations of pre-hire assessment. The third is interview tools. So in particular, there's been a lot of attention in the kinds of tools where either there's a one-way or a two-way video interview. You give that to an algorithm, and the algorithm outputs some sort of information about that candidate. And then fourth is performance management. So stepping away from just kind of like the hiring portion of our HR leadership duties, we'll see a lot more AI in terms of figuring out all those different performance management KPIs that we're tracking. So I love talking about the future a little bit. And one of the funny things about AI, and for anyone who's been just watching this over the last 6 months, the speed that the world is changing due to AI is just incredible, right? So like a year ago, and of course AI exists, it's been existent for decades, but a year ago AI just wasn't in kind of the national conscience, and now due to GPT, it certainly is. So GPT is incredible, and when it came out, it felt like magic. But now to me, it's almost starting to feel like the last generation of tools. And of course, it'll evolve. But what I see as kind of the next kind of step forward in these sorts of tools are what is oftentimes being called AI agents or automated agents. So just to give you a comparison of what these sorts of tools can do, right now, ChatGPT executes a prompt at a time. So you tell it, tell me all the things that I should be looking for as I hire for position X. This next generation of AI agents will be able to be given a goal and then prompt itself until we reach the conclusion of that goal. So it won't just be relying on the human to kind of like say, okay, what's the next step in this process? It'll be able to go through the steps of a process to rearrange the order that we need to be doing things to ultimately get to a goal, and then to keep prompting until it actually gets to what the human operator is looking for. Secondly, GPT is trained on a certain amount of data from a certain time period. So if you ask ChatGPT, what's the weather in Chicago yesterday? It doesn't know because it's not trained on that data. It's trained on data going back a few years. And of course, it's the data from 2022 through to like the beginning of human civilization. So that's like a long time period. But it's not being trained on new data. The next generation of agents will be able to go online and find that information. So if it doesn't have that information, it'll be able to go and search Google, search Bing, and find that new information. And then third, the current chat GPT and the current tools can recommend something that the human should do, or to output something that the human could then take and then use in whatever context we want, right? So we tell it, hey, create a resume for me given my background. But the next generation of AI agent is going to be able to actually go online and do those things, right? So you won't just be able to say like, where can I order a pizza? You'll be able to say, go order me a pizza. And then it'll go on Domino's.com or whatever actual good pizza restaurant is in your town, and will be able to order a pizza. Sorry if Domino's on the call. I don't think you are. The other thing that we should be aware of as HR managers is not only how are we in the HR department using AI, but how are applicants going to be using these emerging tools? To date, I think there's a couple of ways that applicants are definitely using these tools. And I think that probably by now, like we're like accustomed to the fact that our applicants are going to be using some of these things. So first of all, resume tailoring is super easy, right? So upload your resume to ChatGPT and say, hey, I'm applying for a job at RChilli. I'm applying for a job at Microsoft, whatever. And here's all the details. And here's the detailed job description. Tailor my resume, right? So that's something that we probably as HR professionals encourage candidates to do. Now, instead of taking an hour, that takes 15 seconds. So, very similar for cover letter generation. So if we've asked folks to create a cover letter going back many decades, now that process is instant. And it's not simply just, hey, ChatGPT, write me a cover letter. It's upload the cover letter that I've written that's in my voice, that includes the things that I think are important, and say, okay, now I'd like 50 different versions of this that are customized by different job titles for different companies. I think we'll also see a lot of networking automation too. So I think that all of us, particularly if we've had a stint in sales in our career, are familiar with a ton of tools that are out there to automate the sales process, where we say, hey, go on LinkedIn, pull in all these sorts of people, and then write an email to them. Think something like an Apollo, for example. Candidates are doing that as well now too, right? So it's saying, go out, find all the people that are hiring for this sort of a role, and give me that information and tell me who I should talk to first. in less than 6 months, we're going to see the next generation of this. And here's a couple ways that this is going to pop up. So the first application is candidates are going to be able to apply to thousands of jobs with one click. And if we as HR leaders are currently overwhelmed with like all of the like instant apply that we get from LinkedIn or from Indeed, like when I post a job on LinkedIn, within the hour, I have hundreds of applications, and they're not generally the best applications that I'm going to get. They're the people that are just kind of doing that, just clicking. We're going to see a lot more of that, but it's going to be more sophisticated. So it won't just be people that are, that are doing the equivalent of applying for 1,000 jobs. These are going to be applications to jobs that come with a tailored resume, that come with a dynamically written cover letter for the employer. So they're going to look a lot better, but we're going to see a lot more applications. And the second thing, this just popped up in the last week. There's a tool that just came out where let's say we're having a two-way Zoom conversation. You're interviewing me. I can set my AI to listen to the questions that you're asking, transcribe those questions in real time, query the AI to give me a good tailored response in my own voice, basically. And then I can read that off to you. Now, that works really badly today, right? So if anyone's interested in this link, I'll send you the link. Basically, like just these couple guys hacked this together. It doesn't work really well, but these are exactly the sorts of things where we see something, it's kind of like, oh, that's interesting, but that feels like a toy. And in 6 months, given the speed of technological process, that'll be a real thing. And then I included these examples. Automate your job search. I don't know if these tools are even good, but they're out there. I love the second one, Lazy Apply. Lazy Apply is going to be the kind of tools that many of our applicants are going to be using over the next couple of years. Let's talk about those ethical considerations, and we're going to talk about three. The first is transparency, and before I kind of jump into this one in detail, I always think about these three pillars are not ones that just like I came up with. These are, if you kind of read the literature about what you might call safe AI, some people call it responsible AI, these are the things that are big. So these are not just like John Rood came up with these in the HR hiring context, but if you kind of like do some research into how do we as like humans in a society roll out AI in a way that's beneficial for us, these are the three that are going to come up. But I've kind of translated them into the HR context. So what is transparency in this context? On the applicant side, which is mostly what I think we're talking about, this is understanding that an automated or an AI-powered tool is being used in the process, right? So someone applies for a job, they have, if we're being transparent, the right to understand, here are the ways that you're going to be evaluated. Oftentimes there's a discussion of what data is being used to make those decisions. That's really important. So it's both what data is being used to train an algorithm that then is going to kind of judge or evaluate my application. And then secondly, how is that decision actually being made, right? What are the factors that the algorithm is using to say, Michael would be a better applicant for this job than John would be? Third, most transparency discussions have either an opt-out or an accommodation request. And we as HR managers are very familiar with providing accommodations, particularly in the context of the American Disabilities Act. That's going to definitely be here in the world of AI as well. These transparency requirements are a part of basically every single emerging piece of regulation that I have seen. So I think that, the world in which we use kind of these tools in the background is basically ending, right? So the tools that we're using are going to be like familiar. They're going to be something that the applicants understand that they're using. And, I think in this context of the employment market right now, where, we're having trouble getting enough Gen Z folks into the workforce and they have different expectations of their employers, I think that you'll see a lot of companies that get called out on LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever on the internet about using certain tools if those tools aren't being used in a fair way. So I think that there's some, not only some kind of regulatory risk there, but there's some kind of PR type risk as well. The second big consideration is the one that comes to mind, I think, first when people think about this issue, which is bias, right? So in this context, bias refers to the possibility that an automated system could misuse protected classifications. So race, gender, things like disability status, things like protected veteran status, et cetera, et cetera. And the ones that we're kind of familiar with from our Title VII and from our kind of more generalized hiring compliance work. This is going to be real basic overview for folks that like use these systems or studied any kind of machine learning or whatever, but I want to make sure that we have a good basis of it. AI systems are trained on data, right? So if we say, hey, we want the system to figure out who are our best employees in this frontline position, and then go hire people that look like that, or that their resumes look like that. If we're training that, and if we're training an AI with that information, with that data, there's this phrase in machine learning and data science that's called garbage in, garbage out. And what that means is, in this context, if we are training our AI systems with data that encodes some of that societal bias that we've all become like really, I think, intimately aware over the last couple of years, we should have the expectation that unless we intervene, the results that come out of those systems are going to be biased as well, right? So we have to be very careful about the data that we use to train these systems. And I always say, like, most bias in the AI world is unintentional, right? There's, I'm not aware of any case study where anyone has trained an algorithm to say, like, hey, you should, look at the gender of these candidates, but don't tell anybody. That's not what we're talking about, right? We're talking about unintentional bias that's kind of encoded in training data, and those are the things that we have to kind of work hard to figure out and to mitigate. Quick case study on this. This is a case study that happened at Amazon. It was kind of a long time ago, and so I use it because it's not like a hot button issue. This is from a long time ago, but it shows why this is such a hot button issue today. So long ago in 2014, Amazon created an algorithm to try to figure out who would be its most successful candidates as software engineers. So it took all the information they had about the software engineers that were currently successful at Amazon and trained an algorithm to figure that question out when they turn it on the applicants. Of course, that data that Amazon is using to train it encoded some of those cultural biases that are just existent in our society. Namely, at Amazon at the time, and I wouldn't be surprised if it's the case now, the vast majority of software engineers were men. So the algorithm learns that and then does things like try to figure out who are the men and who are the women, because obviously the folks who are creating this algorithm said, hey, you can't look at gender, you can't look at race, right? So don't look at like here's a Susan versus here's a Bill. But the algorithm learns to route around that. So it did things like it would rank lower candidates that went to women's colleges. It would rank higher candidates that played football and lower candidates that played field hockey. So it learns to kind of route around those things. Amazon kind of went through a couple rounds of trying to figure out, like, how can we make this a tool that doesn't do exactly that, but ultimately couldn't get it figured out and had to end the use of that tool. So again, that's a long time ago. We have a huge amount of technological progression now, but that's kind of like the core issue when we think about bias in AI hiring that we're trying to mitigate. The third issue is explainability. So explainability is a human user's ability to understand why an algorithm is making the decisions that it's making. And if we have an explainable system, we understand what is kind of going on within the algorithm. So it allows us in the HR context to make sure that our algorithms are making decisions that are fair and that are legal. So for example, we want to make sure that our algorithms are looking like things like years of experience or things like very specific skills that are tied to job performance. And of course, not things like gender, like race, like disability status, etc. In the world of AI and machine learning, you'll hear this really basic distinction between monitored and unmonitored algorithms. And for the folks here on RChilli, or you folks are total experts on this already, but I just want to make sure everyone has a good background on these topics. So if we think about an unmonitored algorithm, that's what's sometimes referred to as a black box, where we say, here's the result that we want, you go figure it out, but we don't actually know how the algorithm is figuring it out. Whereas a more monitored algorithm, which would be more explainable, is one where the algorithm is able to output, here are kind of the ways that we're making this decision. Here are the factors that the algorithm has ultimately decided are important in the decision, how they're weighted together. And then we as humans can look at that and say, like, oh, okay, so here's the ones that are legal, defensible. Those are the ones that we should use, and we're going to exclude the factors that are not defensible in that way. Here's a really quick case study. So I was talking to an attorney who has 20 years in the pre-employment evaluation space. So he's been doing this for a long time. He was talking about a company that was vetting a resume screening tool. And before this employer put this tool into effect, they decided to go get an audit of it. And after they audited what was going on, kind of like in the black box of this screening tool, they found that the tool said there was two factors that were most predictive of excellent job performance in this role. The first was that the candidate's name was Justin. And the second was that the candidate played lacrosse in high school, right? So this algorithm was looking for markers of gender and was kind of giving extra points to men, basically, and it's looking for markers of high socioeconomic status. So those are things that, you know, if we see our algorithm is doing that, we don't want that to happen, right? And then we can take action. So of course, this employer decided not to use the tool, but those are the challenges or risks that we're trying to kind of route around. Okay, let's talk a little bit about some of the upcoming regulation. This is the year that regulation is really happening in the AI world, and it makes total sense, right? So a year ago, probably most politicians, especially at state and municipal levels, had not thought much about AI. It wasn't on the network evening news. It wasn't on 60 Minutes the way that it is now. So we're going to see a big wave of this regulation starting this year and then going on to the next couple of years. The first, kind of the canary in the coal mine regulation here, is called New York City Local Law 144. So this law applies to companies that have offices in the city of New York. And there's, when I say that, like I say, there's kind of like quotation, like square quotes around that, because there's a lot of variability. Like if you have remote employees, they live in New York, you don't have an office, or you have an office, but your remote employees work in New Jersey. There's a lot of distinctions there that we talk about with our clients on a daily basis. We're going to deep dive into that. But the basic thrust of 144 is that it requires companies that use automated or AI-driven tools to get an external independent audit of those tools for racial and gender bias. I think we'll talk about those details, but statewide initiatives are coming in a lot of different places. They're going to kind of replicate some of those terms, particularly kind of that requirement that users of these tools get audits. So we'll see that in New Jersey. We'll see that in California, which is always the big one. We'll see it in New Hampshire, the state of New York, in addition to the city of New York, and Washington, D.C. So I put this map together. I always like this map, but just kind of the outline of where we currently have legislation that's either been passed, like in New York, or that's coming out of committee and is likely to be on its way to passage, like in California, Colorado, etc. I just put the slide together a couple of days ago because I was thinking about and talking about this issue with a couple of HR leaders at SHRM, and they were talking about how this kind of feels like like what happened with pay transparency. So that's, I think, what's going to happen in this world. So in the pay transparency world, pay transparency passes in New York. Then it passes in California, then, Nevada, Colorado, Washington do it. And now a bunch of states are doing it. And so when you have all of these states, especially these large population centers like California, New York, et cetera, that are doing this, then HR leaders start to say, like, well, wait a second. Like when this was just Colorado, when this was just New York, we could kind of route around that, right? We could say, okay, if you're remote, we'll put a little thing at the bottom and says, hey, if you're a Colorado applicant, click here for pay transparency or whatever. But then when you see all these states doing it, there's a tipping point where you as the HR leader are not just saying, okay, we have to comply state by state, but saying, wait a second, pay transparency is just a thing. And if it's going to be a thing in like 30 states, then we just have to do it. And that's what I think this AI regulation is going to feel like. So, today companies are kind of scrambling to think about, well, does this New York law apply to me? In a year, people think about, okay, we have New York and California. Now what do we do? In more like 18 months or 2 years, we'll kind of reach that tipping point in my prediction where companies just say, like, okay, what's the set of stuff we need to do to get compliant with this kind of mishmash of laws? The big, let's talk a little bit about New York Local Law 144. So I'd referenced that previously. Local Law 144 goes into effect on July 5th of this year. The kind of that effective deadline was pushed back like 4 times. Just last week, we had a meeting with the city of New York where they were doing Q&A, and there was a bunch of Q&A left at the end. So This is a law that's going into effect, but also feels like there's elements that are up in the air, which is a really challenging thing to deal with from a legal standpoint, from HR standpoint, and for us from an audit standpoint. The law requires, as I had mentioned, an independent audit of the outputs of automated decision tools. So in this, for this law to be compliant, we don't have to we don't have to look at code. We don't have to see what's happening in the black box. We just look at the outputs, and we're required to generate a chart like on the left. So we have, a thousand applicants or whatever that goes through a certain screening tool. We have to then record what percentage of applicants from each of these groups made it through that screen. So New York is interested in gender, men and women. And importantly, my strong prediction will be that in the next 18 months, not just men and women, we'll have men, women, no reply, non-binary, et cetera. And then also the kind of the EEO racial and ethnic groups, including multiracial. Then we have to do that intersectionally, right? So ultimately, our output for us as auditors and what New York is looking for is this chart on the left. This chart comes directly from the city of New York. So this is not like, this is something where, I mentioned there's elements up in the air. This is not up in the air. This is what we have to generate, showing for every group by race and then by race and gender, what's basically the pass rate of a certain automated tool within the hiring process. Folks that have done disparate impact assessments or have seen that in their work before will be familiar with this kind of chart, will be familiar with the language of selection rate and impact ratio, which I'm always happy to deep dive with on people. But the challenges of this are not really from a data perspective, right? So like the figuring this stuff out is not complicated. I mean, I always tell people, like I covered my ability to do this particular audit work in Mr. Dinkel's 10th grade stats class. It's not particularly complicated, but there are a couple complications. One of them is that most companies don't keep all this information, especially for candidates, right? There's really good reasons why most companies are not keeping the racial data on their job applicants. Secondly, and noted here on the slide, this audit result is public, right? So according to the law, to be compliant with New York 144, you have to do this audit work, and then companies have to put this on their website. And this is like, speaking really, really bluntly, this is the last thing that most companies want to put on their website, even if their data looks good, right? Because then applicants can look at this, then the media looks at this. Importantly, plaintiffs, lawyers look at this stuff and can be a cause for action. To comply with 144 doesn't actually say that our numbers have to pass any particular mark, right? So when we think about that impact ratio, which is on the right side, that's kind of like where the rubber meets the road. New York 144 just says, hey, you have to figure it out and put it on your website. But then if you put this on your website, EEOC is extremely interested, particularly for large companies, on this information. And this can be a potential cause of action. So that's a big challenge. The second big challenge is that this law, as I had mentioned previously, is going to be copycatted in several different jurisdictions. So California, always kind of the big kahuna of HR regulation, has a bill that does this and more, that's going through their committee process. It passed committee, so it's probably 18 months away from being enforced, probably 6 months to 12 months away from being finalized. But we're going to see this sort of kind of audit and then post publicly in a lot of different markets. And for the attorneys watching out there, if you thought that complying with this was hard in New York, wait till you see that California and DC explicitly have a right of private action for this. So, and DC was the first one to do it. That might actually be in effect before California. So you will see a wave of small plaintiffs, law firms going after companies for this kind of information. Okay, we talked about states, talked about municipalities. Obviously, the one that everyone is most interested in is, what is the federal government going to do? It seems relatively unlikely, given what's going on kind of in our country generally and in the way that Congress works, that we'll see big new regulation of this specific issue. It's possible, right? And so it's been proposed, but as everyone knows, who reads the news, it's hard to get anything done in Congress right now, and I'm not sure that that's going to change in the next couple of years. But that said, there are, of course, existing laws that govern the use of pre-hiring tools, that govern the use of fair hiring, particularly Title VII, particularly American Disabilities Act. And EEOC has been really explicit that those laws still apply to new AI tools. A couple of things have happened recently that have been really clear that the federal government is going to take this issue seriously. The first is EEOC came out with what they call their draft enforcement plan. This was back in February. The EEOC identified this issue of fairness in algorithmic hiring as one of their top 3 regulatory priorities for the next 5 years, right? So this is going to be a big thing that EEOC is watching. Secondly, just a couple of weeks ago, these 4 federal agencies put out a joint press release, and they all said that this is going to be a critical thing that they're going to be watching. So not just EEOC, but Federal Trade Commission, Department of Justice, and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau are all going to be looking at this issue really closely. So if you are thinking, okay, well, there's this thing in New York, maybe California, do I have to do anything? Like, yeah, this is going to be a big issue federally, even independent of all those state regulations. EEOC has been super duper crystal clear on this concept, which is that the existing federal legislation, specifically, explicitly like Title VII and like ADA, apply to these new tools. There's a phrase that every time they put out a press release, they always repeat it, which is that you can't blame the algorithm. So for us as HR professionals, for us as employers, if we're getting something that comes from a vendor and it's outputting results that aren't fair, that are in violation of Title VII, EEOC is clear that that's on the employer. And so for us as HR professionals, we need to make just crystal clear that we understand what's going on in our tools, that we're doing things like working through that audit process, which we saw in New York 144. And in fact, I had a conversation with a lawyer who is in this space, and he was making the case really strongly, and he works in Title VII. That's all he does, and he's actually on the plaintiff side. And he was making the case that given that the federal government has not, and EEOC in particular, has not been particularly explicit about what companies actually have to do to kind of like put these Venn diagram circles together of Title VII, ADA, and new AI tools. His prediction was that lots of companies are ultimately just going to go through this audit process, which is required now in New York City, will be required in other states. But as more companies start to kind of take this issue seriously, more companies will probably work through that audit process internally, even if it's not yet explicitly required. Okay. Couple other things, and this is going to transition us back to Michael and back to the great partnership with RChilli that we have here today. So what should HR leaders do? The first is someone has to own this issue in the organization, and then someone has to kind of take this issue and be able to work across functions. So at the very minimum, someone has to have a really up-to-date list of all the tools, all the algorithms that are used in the hiring process. They have to understand what is the data being used. They have to understand what is the output of those systems, and make sure that they have some understanding of where do we go to get the data to learn if these tools are fair. If this is in HR, which is where it probably ends up living, HR absolutely has to bring legal, they have to bring compliance, they have to bring senior management into these discussions so that there is a kind of an organization-wide discussion about, how do we make sure we are on the right side of the laws, and how do we make sure that we're on the right side of the potential public relations hurdles? We talked about Amazon. Like, Amazon doesn't want me using their name in this slide talking about all this stuff that they did, right? That's not a good PR look, and that's going to be a risk over the next several years. Secondly, and explicitly thinking through for us as RChilli customers on this call, understanding what our vendors are doing is really important. So, Michael gave a brief discussion about what RChilli does to reduce bias in the hiring process. If we are a user of RChilli or a user of other vendors, and most people have probably several vendors in the HR that are using AI in HR, understand those compliance plans, right? So understand if you're a vendor in this space, like you're thinking about these issues, your customers, the employers really need to understand what you as the vendor are doing. Secondly, especially in the pre-hire assessment world, vendors have to have a validity assessment, right? There has to be some discussion that the tools that are being used for pre-hire assessments actually do something, like they actually work and produce outputs that are germane to the hiring decision. So making sure that as HR leaders that we have all that stuff together for all of our vendors is going to be really important. The third thing, this is a little farther afield from some of the compliance things that we've been talking about, but I think it's really important that HR leaders start considering their AI policy internally. And what does that mean? It means a couple of things. First of all, we have to make sure that we start to think about how are employees using this new generation of AI tools. I'll give you an example. I come into the education world, and in the education world, we develop a lot of like written contents. We develop curriculum, practice tests, et cetera, et cetera. So in that world, there's this discussion where, let's say I have to create, a new curriculum for third grade math or whatever, and I go to ChatGPT and say, please create me a curriculum for third grade math, and it outputs something. And I take it and kind of edit it a little bit, and then we publish it. Who owns that curriculum? Does my company own that curriculum? Does OpenAI, the makers of ChatGPT, own that curriculum? Then the next phase of that question, the phase that's going to be big with kind of legal questions the next 5 years is it the case that the people that owned the data that trained ChatGPT have some sort of a claim on my curriculum, right? Because ChatGPT is not creating this out of thin air. ChatGPT is looking back at all the third grade math curriculum that it has in basically in all of recorded human history if it's on the internet, and someone owned those things. So there's a lot of questions there. Secondly, how do we provide guardrails on the use of of AI tools by applicants, right? So are we going to say, hey, if we get a resume and it was written by ChatGPT, like that's a thumbs down? Do we feel good about saying that? Do we feel good about thinking through, for example, I was talking about using AI to respond live in real time to interview questions. If we see someone doing that, is their interview over, right? Is that something where we say thumbs down? And importantly, how do we know that happens, right? So those kinds of policies, I think will be really important. Okay. Let me pause there. So we'll transition back and I'll stop the screen share here. I'm going to look at the chat for a second. If you have questions or anything that that was kind of unclear in our presentation, first of all, feel free to email Michael or I. Would love to chat through your questions or put them in the chat right there. Let's see, Michael, do you want to say any kind of closing words as we start to wrap up here?
Yeah, no, I think all that was super insightful. And a lot of that, I feel like most of the people out there aren't aware that that's going to be coming down the pipeline, or to your point, how quickly it's going to be happening. So, I guess kind of closing thoughts on my end is we want to encourage all of our Chili's current customers, to leverage our relationship with Proceptual, take advantage of their expertise to continue to maintain this compliance going forward. And for anyone out there who, wants to learn more, please reach out to us. We're happy to help you guys and ensure that we're maximizing your efforts on the recruitment side, but also on the compliance side.
We have a question in the Q&A. Thanks for leaving this. So it says, John, thanks for the presentation. Thank you for attending. What is the workaround from here? Can technology solve this, or is no technology the best approach? As I said in the beginning of our presentation, like generally where my head is, like I'm pro technology, right? Technology advances. There's no way to put this genie kind of back in the bottle. That's not how any of this works. So I think that as our technology gets better, I think that this is just going to be a constant discussion that that HR technology vendors have of how do we keep reducing bias. It's interesting that you kind of pose this question as, can technology solve it, or is no tech the best approach? I do think that as we start to have some of these regulations come on board in the next several months to years, we'll have companies that roll back their use of certain vendors. And I don't know who those vendors will be yet. Like, it's too early for me to say, and I probably wouldn't even if our data showed that. But we as auditors who do things like compliance for New York Local Law 144, we see some results come back that don't look good. And, oftentimes, if you're thinking about this from the employer's perspective, the employer doesn't really have the ability to go back and like change the way that the vendor is training their data. They have limited ability to even go under the hood and see like what's the code that the vendor is using. So I think that there'll be a lot of situations where HR leaders decide to discontinue the use of certain technical tools. And that being the case, I think that companies that on the HR vendor side that are getting out ahead of this issue, that see bias reduction not just as like a talking point or like a website point, but see it as like the core of the work that they are doing, and then that are really proud to say, come audit us, right? Come show us, come look at our data, come look at our outputs. It's super fair. That I think is going to happen. So I think that we'll have more HR vendors are kind of winning on this issue of bias. Okay, second question. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you for your attendance. What is a problem with using artificial intelligence to do recruiting tasks? So let's talk about it just from a compliance perspective. I think that if we're thinking about using AI to do recruiting, we'll think about it as our funnel, right? So every company has a hiring funnel where we get resumes at the top, at the bottom, we make hiring decisions, and then there's steps in the middle, right? So if we're using an automated tool in that process somewhere, it's really important that we understand at each part of that process, how are the decisions being made, and then how do the outputs look? So think about this from two perspectives, sort of the process perspective and the output perspective. From the process perspective, we're looking at issues like explainability and transparency, which we had discussed previously. So do we know how our algorithm is making these decisions? If it says, Michael should advance in the hiring process, but John shouldn't, is it because, Michael lives south of Chicago and John lives on the north of Chicago, right? Like things that are not job appropriate. Or do we know that it's because Michael has more experience, has more skills, et cetera? Secondly, it's important that we understand the outputs of those processes. And, given the context of some of the regulatory discussions that we've been going over here, making sure that the outputs of our hiring process by gender and by race or ethnicity, that those are fair, and that the data kind of shows that they look fair. That's really important too. So I think that having processes where we feel like, okay, the process is good, if the output is not good, and again, like not coming from my personal opinion, from the opinion of the regulators, especially in New York and California, that's something that people want to take a pretty close look at. Okay, so Michael, you give your closing words. Thank you so much. This has been a great collaboration with RChilli, which will continue. I'm more than happy. This is what I do all day, right? So we discuss these issues, we do compliance work, we do training in this space. So more than happy to talk to anyone on this call. I've got my email there. I do have one other question popped up. Let's see. Do you have any predictions for which state will follow New York in implementing new data privacy regulations? How challenging will this be in comparison to the GDPR? That's a really good question. I'm going to take off my expert hat and put on my very well-informed hat on this, right? Because I don't follow data privacy as closely as I do these other compliance things. I think you'll see a couple things, right? And so again, this is like comes with a big caveat, like ask your lawyer, do your own research. But California just did a huge overhaul to their privacy regulations that had a lot to do with the use of AI. So I think that California will be in the lead here, as they often are. Colorado has kind of come from behind to kind of lead the pack on some of these data security issues. So they've got a substantial bill that I believe has passed, but is not implemented yet. Virginia had something that was similar as well. So I think that you will see a lot of states that are dealing with this question of, in the AI world, who owns the data, right? So someone comes on our site, applies, and then we put their resume into a screening tool. Who owns the outputs of those tools? I think those will be big questions in the future. Okay, just checking around for other questions. Looks like that's it. Okay, Michael, any final closing thoughts?
No, that's it. Just thanks again, John, for taking the time to share all that with us today, and thanks everyone on the call and the insightful Q&A.
All right, thanks, Michael, again. Thanks everybody for attending, and hopefully we'll be in touch.